The weight skin reading actually describes a template for the traditional format for any medical encounter. So you can all likely recall a time in your lives when you visited a doctor, or maybe over the past year and a half, it may be more likely that you had a telephone meeting or a Zoom meeting with your doctor due to the pandemic and not being able to meet them in person. And upon reading that portion of Waitskin's article, you'd be surprised by just how rigidly formulated and scripted a lot of these encounters are. They strike us in the moment as being spontaneous and natural and authentic as you're having the conversation with the doctor, but this part of the reading really illuminates and emphasizes the artificially contrived and scripted nature of those doctor-patient interactions and conversations. And they're scripted in a way for the doctor to produce a concrete, demonstrable result by reaching a diagnosis. That's the doctor's goal during that medical encounter. And through the doctor's active structuring of the conversation with their patient, they kind of cut out anything that doesn't contribute to that final result of diagnosing the issue and prescribing treatment. So the first part of the medical encounter is typically the chief complaint, where the patient explains what's bothering them and what prompted them to visit the doctor in the first place. And that's usually how every conversation with the doctor starts, and the doctor is then subtly trying to cut to the chase and get to the diagnosable issue. But they express that idea in a more professional way and with sufficient bedside manner to get the desired reciprocity from the patient, such as, what can I help you with today? Or what brings you into my office today? And then you respond by telling them your back hurts or you're having headaches or whatever is ailing you. And then the second part, once the chief complaint has been established, is the present illness, wherein the patient elaborates in more detail on the specific symptoms they're experiencing and other contextual information that's relevant, like maybe the medications they're taking or whether or not they have allergies or stuff that could contribute to their chief complaint that they're coming to the doctor with. And already the doctor is guiding the patient's line of conversation. Any sort of unhelpful talk that doesn't move the conversation towards reaching a diagnosis is seen as a tangent, a deviation that needs to be steered back on track. Patients can sometimes get too much into their life stories and try to explain their chief complaint from the perspective of their biographies and feel the need to tell the doctor the whole story, including details that the patient believes is relevant, and the doctors subtly and gently redirect the conversation and the patient back on topic to get to the point. So doctors have a lot of micro level power in shaping your everyday interactions with them. Like, for example, you may not ever recall interrupting a doctor while they're talking to you. That just seems unthinkable and inconceivable to cut off a doctor. Just like in week 3 when I mentioned the example of sitting on your desk as a student. It's inconceivable because in the subject position of the patient, your field of potential action is limited and relegated to being the good patient who's forthcoming with relevant details, but only speaking when spoken to. And as a result, the patient may not really feel able to fully express what's weighing on their mind. They're largely rendered docile in the same way the subject of the ideal gym goer we saw when we examined fitness centers as disciplinary spaces. And you always see doctors taking notes during your conversation, but never see those notes. Not that you could read them anyways, because doctors' handwriting can be a bit scribbly. I mean, I'm not one to judge. I can't read my own writing an hour after I wrote it. But when the doctor's doing that, they're writing not only your symptoms and their ideas, but they're writing a written record of the encounter for your medical record. And in that writing, they're not going to deliberately make themselves look bad. They're not going to write in that written record, oh, I interrupted the patient at this point, or I thought their points in this part of the conversation weren't really relevant to their pain, so I ignored that part. Or I was in a hurry to just get out of there that day. I had a big golf trip, so I just cut off the patient from what they were saying. In the written record, the doctor paints the interaction as a lot more orderly and even-sided rather than how one-sided it may have actually been. So that Waitskin reading was very eye-opening. It changed the way that I'll look at past conversations and even future conversations with doctors. It frames those past conversations I've had in a different light now, now that I know just how much structure and pre-planning and training was actually behind this seemingly spontaneous and authentic conversation that I was under the impression that it was. Turned out to be a lot more manufactured and pre-produced to get the customer, the client, the patient in and out. So next time you're talking with your doctor, either in their office or maybe over the phone or over Zoom, take notice of how the doctor initiates the conversation and guides the flow of the conversation, and potentially what effects that may have and potentially what intentions they may have in doing so, and how the doctor is driving and directing that conversation, potentially in attempts to identify the illness and make a diagnosis. That's really the prime directive for the doctor, is diagnosing whatever you're experiencing, whatever you came to them reporting problems of. So it may feel like a normal conversation, but in the doctor's head, the wheels are turning as they're running through the mental list of potential diagnoses and then eliminating certain options depending on what information arises during that conversation. And then maybe once they have an idea, they won't tell you right away what they think your diagnosis is, but they'll ask you more questions that either confirms or denies what they were thinking. And like I said, they're liable to cut off the conversation or steer the conversation away from anything they feel doesn't contribute to making a diagnosis and getting a result. But like I said with the hammer and nail analogy, if the hammer is the diagnosis, then no matter what issue you bring to them, it'll appear to them as a nail that can be hit with their specific hammer of their specific medical knowledge and treatments. And as a result, they could potentially misdiagnose the issue depending on their specific medical knowledge, their branch of knowledge that they specialize in and that they're trained in. So I remember one summer a long time ago, I had a red mark under one of my eyes, like a dry red patch of skin. And I went to my GP, my family doctor, and general practitioners tend to have a general knowledge of medical problems and solutions. So my doctor just saw this patch of skin as being close to the eye, and they very quickly decided upon referring me to an optometrist because they assumed it must have something to do with my eye. So I go to the optometrist, and because they were an optometrist, they also saw this issue as being an eye issue because it seemed close to the eye. So he presumed that this issue belonged under the domain of his branch of medical knowledge and his subfield of optometry, and it could be fixed by his subfield's practices and treatments. According to the hammer of optometry, his specific hammer, he saw my skin issue as a nail that could be hit with his hammer of optometry, as an eye issue that's amenable to eye science. He assumed that the red skin was a symptom of some sort of underlying minor eye infection. So he prescribed these eye drops that I dropped into my eye twice a day for pretty much the rest of the summer. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with how annoying and frustrating it can be to try to put eye drops in. But I believed them. I've diligently followed the doctor's orders for months without seeing any result. I just trusted that they knew what they were doing and they knew what they were saying and that their diagnosis was correct. But for months, the red skin remained and was not only unaffected, but seemed to get worse at times, unrelated to my administration of the eye drops. So summer ended and I went back to university and decided to get a second opinion from a doctor at the university clinic. And almost as soon as I walked into the doctor's office, they remarked, "Oh, that's eczema. That's a skin condition. I have this cream for you to take." And I used that cream, and that red patch of skin was gone within a week. So I felt like I was taking a fool for following this lengthy regimen prescribed by the optometrist based on their misdiagnosis, because they assumed that my issue belonged to their field of knowledge and was subject to their specific optometry related approaches and treatments. They were just trying to get to that diagnosis, reach that demonstrable result, and solve the problem instead of trying to understand the problem itself or the potential causes and contributions to it. I've since occasionally experienced eczema on other parts of my body, like my knuckles, but that's usually or almost exclusively in the winter when it's cold and dry. This was the only time I experienced eczema during the summer, so there must have been some sort of non-seasonal element contributing to it. So I imagine that that initial outbreak may have been caused or contributed to by stress or some environmental factor. But none of the three doctors, even the one who got it right at the end, considered that possibility or asked me any questions related to whether I was experiencing stress. None of them really inquired into any aspect of my life or mental state at the time, of which eczema may have been just a small surface byproduct, something that emerges on the surface, the tip of the iceberg that you can see and is indicative of an underlying problem. So doctors are arbiters of discourse in the sense that they choose which topics are included within the realm of medical conversation and subsequently which topics are excluded. So they're the ones who determine whether or not your problem is a relevant one or an irrelevant one. They exercise a lot more power over you in these micro level interactions because of their empowered discursive subject position relative to your subject position of the patient, which has a lot less power within that discourse. Again, the doctor might not be consciously aware. They might not be saying in their heads that they're going to deliberately and consciously ignore certain areas of concern the patient may have. Ideology is working on the doctors too. They may not be cognizant of how their use of medical language, how the whole structure of their discourse precludes them from exploring certain topics before it even reaches conscious thought. Because if doctors become too aware of the ideological role they're fulfilling, they may feel differently because, like I said, they want to help and they often do help. But if they realize the true extent that they may be reinforcing current social structures, they may stop or refuse to play the role of ideological facilitator, and the system may break down, and the system doesn't want that. They want doctors to be health conscious but not socially conscious. So for ideology to work, it's important for no one to think about it for too long or be consciously aware of it or point it out overtly. It's just relegated to the realm of the unsaid, the unspoken. So within those micro level interactions between the patient and doctor, there's usually two voices at play, not the voice of the patient and the voice of the doctor. I'm talking about the voice of the life world, which is the patient's everyday non-technical problems that are brought up during that conversation, and then the voice of medicine, which is strictly the scientific rationality that restricts topics to only include technical matters. And they're both competing to be heard within that conversation. You may raise a concern you have regarding the stress you're experiencing at work, and that's the life world voice popping up. But then the life world voice may be cut off by the voice of medicine, the voice of reason, if you will, which again steers and redirects the conversation back to focusing on the medical symptoms and all the technical concepts and terminology. So like I said with Habermas and the Frankfurt School, science and medicine can't solve everything, but they claim to be able to. They've expanded their scope beyond just the purely scientific and medical realms to now addressing social problems, but again, as if they were medical problems. So the discourse applies its own strictly technical logic to distinctly non-technical phenomena. And the voice of medicine can't really speak for the voice of the life world. They're different languages entirely. It's a misapplication of tools to the problem at hand. You have a social problem at hand and you're trying to fix it with a scientific tool or a medical solution. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So this can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction felt by the patients, where they feel that they're not being heard by the doctor. They feel that their real problems and issues aren't being addressed. Have you ever had that? Have you ever left a doctor's office or hung up the phone after talking with the doctor where you feel like you couldn't fully express what's been afflicting you and you just wish you said more, or you wish you had the opportunity to say more? That's because the life world voice was likely being cut off and unheard relative to the voice of medicine. The Waitskin reading also goes over some examples of real medical encounters that illustrate this power relation at play. One of the examples was that someone came to the doctor with symptoms of depression, and they were feeling depressed because of their social and economic situation. The patient was experiencing a precarious employment situation in their working life. Their union was about to go on strike, and consequently, the patient was feeling a sense of doom and anxiety and mood disturbances as a result. And throughout this medical encounter, throughout this conversation the patient's having with their doctor, the patient is trying to express the voice of the life world, and they're recurrently bringing up these social issues that they believe or that they know is an important part of why they're feeling this way. They know that the social context of uncertain employment prospects is affecting the way they're personally and physiologically feeling right now. But the doctor kind of wipes away all of the social context surrounding their issue and just focuses on the personal and physiological symptoms. They're just listening to the voice of medicine. So there's that tension between the two voices of the life world and medicine, respectively, with each one vying for dominance in the conversation. Or rather, the voice of medicine is vying for complete dominance. The voice of the life world is just vying to be heard. So the doctor de-emphasizes the patient's social concerns, and then they render their social problem technical, and they reframe it as a personal problem, in this case depression, and then they try to fix it from the perspective that it is a personal problem. So they just prescribe antidepressant medications and pills, but those pills aren't going to change the fact that that person's union is about to go on strike. It just helps them cope with these stressful symptoms that are caused by the social situation and the overarching macroeconomic structures in our lives. And due to the medical practitioner's authoritative position in discourse, you mostly just have to take their word for it. Like you recall the phrase doctor's orders, and you just got to follow the doctor's orders. So this patient is likely just going to be popping pills that may numb them at best or have all sorts of unintended negative side effects at worst, and they're still not addressing the real issue at hand. So you'll recall Foucault's formulation of the panopticon and panoptic power, and his proposition that panoptic power has spread to all areas of social life. The basic conception of this idea takes the form of security cameras, but it's so much more than that. For example, it can be seen to have spread into the unequal power dynamics between doctors and patients in the form of the medical gaze. So the medical gaze is the doctor's practice of exposing the patient's body to the field of visibility and objectifying the body of the patient, thus turning it into an object that feels separate and apart from the patient's personal identity, as if in those moments the doctor is staring at the patient's symptoms. The doctor seems to know the secrets of the patient's body more than the patient knows themselves. From this, the doctor can silently palpate and triangulate underlying things about the person's being that the person doesn't even know about themselves, because they don't have that trained eye or that specialist knowledge to know where to look or how to look. So this is a mode of surveillance, as with any form of panoptic power, but also self-surveillance, because as the doctor is wielding their medical gaze on you and staring at you, you begin to start looking at yourself, and your imagination runs wild about what could potentially be wrong with you for the doctor to be staring at you so intently. And like I said, with the confessional technique, there are inherent notions of guilt, like you did something wrong, and like you feel as if the doctor knows it and they're just silently judging. You start objectifying your own body in the same way, and it creates that mind-body separation where you start seeing your own body as just this mysterious thing, this secret thing who needs to be unearthed by this trained expert who's able to see and know more about ourselves than we can perceive or know about ourselves. So this is one of the many intersections between medical discourse and the practical application of power and the exercise of power, where you can see the effects bear themselves out in real concrete life, where it's directly influencing and wielding the power of medical discourse over you in those moments that the doctor is conducting their medical gaze. So this is when your body and your mind fully enter the discourse of medicine and enter into the field of power, consequently, where the patient can be fully brought under the auspices of the professional authority of the medical gaze and put under its thumb Just like I said with the confessional technique, how we voluntarily speak ourselves into the discourse by confessing our sins and thus tacitly acknowledging the discourse's meanings and values related to that sin and bowing down to it. You're kind of voluntarily subjecting yourself to medical discourse and objectifying yourself through practices such as the medical gaze. So have you ever felt the piercing power of the medical gaze? Maybe think about previous doctor-patient interactions you've had in hindsight, and did you feel any panoptic power at work in those potentially uncomfortable micro-level moments of doctor-patient interaction when they're examining and scrutinizing what may be wrong with you? So we've been asking, what ideology does medical discourse facilitate and support? Well, medical discourse can be seen as a mechanism by which neoliberalism and capitalist ideology works to deflect the blame and accountability for the social problems that it causes and offload the blame and responsibility onto the individual who's made to deal with the consequences of the social problems that neoliberalism and capitalism create, such as the mental and physical discomfort and unease we may experience. Medical discourse seeks to support neoliberal ideology by making it seem like it's our responsibility, it's our personal problem that we need to take care of personally. So medical discourse acts as a conveyor of this neoliberal ideology, the idea that any problems you perceive or experience are your own problems that you need to solve. It tries to gloss over the fact that these are problems inherent within the system itself, contradictions within capitalism, and flaws within the neoliberal ideology. And medical discourse rationalizes and implicitly justifies the existing social relations and capitalist economic relations insofar as those relations are discursively constructed to appear rational. And any problems you perceive are attributed to an irrationality on your part. So in order to accomplish this, medical discourse floods our popularly held lexicon with terms such as self-care and self-help, so that you're made to address problems within yourself instead of addressing problems within the social structure. So in this way, medical discourse acts as a neutralizing mechanism for ideology that deflects conscious awareness from the problems of society to make them seem like personal problems that can only be solved personally instead of collectively. And if we can't entertain the realistic possibility that social situations and political structures can be and often are the cause of personal psychological stress and distress, then we can't notice the impact of these structures. We can't scrutinize our social structures the way we scrutinize ourselves, and we can't recognize and come face to face with the source of these socially produced consequences, which we are made to simply accept and cope with, so that we can't mobilize to make structural changes, because that's exactly what ideology doesn't want us to do. So medical discourse robs our social life of their politically and socially charged content. It robs us of our political potential and our political energy by depoliticizing it. So neoliberal ideology and medical discourse work hand in hand to justify and rationalize and insulate and protect capitalist economic relations from being scrutinized or changed.